Well, that's true. Bless your heart gets used a lot, but that is and again, where's the line between Southern and let's go with that, is that, again, it depends on where you're standing, even in the Appalachians, but you'll see a movie that's set in Appalachia and you'll hear y'all. But truly Appalachian would be yuns, not y'all. You know, and I mean, they both are plural use, but yuns and weans and those kind of, instead of all y'all, and that's a more Georgia, Alabama, that's getting farther south. Now, you could say, well, gee, I grew in the southern Cumberlands. Well, you'd hear y'all, and very rarely would you hear yuns. So again, it kind of depends on where you're standing as to what some of that is. Sarvis, do you know what sarvis is? Sarvis. Sarvis is a kind of tree. And in the high Smokies, it's in bloom right now. It has a very delicate little white flower, but it's service berry. Okay? So if you look up in a book, it's going to say this is a service berry. But in this region, it gets called sarvis because the Old English way of pronouncing Service, if you were serving in the king's army, the king's sarvis is the Old English way of pronouncing Service is sarvis. Well, that got remembered is that was the sarvisberry tree, and it got shortened to sarvis. So you get some of these little pieces of Older English, clum as a past tense to climb. So he clumbed the tree. But that's an Older English way of doing it. Now, it's not Old English like Elizabethan English. That's too far back. Sometimes you would hear that, but people from England didn't settle this far west in Elizabethan times. So it's really by the 1700s. Now, some of that English is still around. It gets caught here and just rattles around. There's some things that you've just heard so much your whole life that it would never occur to you that everybody doesn't say that. But yeah, pot calling the kettle black. And there's a wonderful, it's an Old English story, but I've heard Appalachian versions of it about catching the thief. And they can't decide, there's a group of people there, and they can't decide who's taken whatever has been stolen. And so they take a blackened pot and put it on top of a rooster. And they said, now we're gonna turn out the lights, blow out the lights, and everybody's gonna put their hand on the pot. And when the one that's stolen it, the rooster's gonna crow. And then we'll grab and know who it is. Well, of course, the rooster never crows. So they bring the lights back up. And the thief, of course, is the only person that doesn't have black on their hand. So it's a cute little Appalachian story, but you'll find it in England, and you'll find it in other cultures. But I've heard it in Appalachian a lot. But there's the pot calling kettle black. It just made me think of that other story. But you're right. I mean, there are those kind of things. And see, it's funny when you asked me the question, and I was kind of thinking through. Honestly, I didn't even think of that one. I mean, I guess there's so many that are just a part of me that I don't think of it as an Appalachian or a regional kind of thing. It's like, well, gee, everybody says bless your heart. And knows that that's not a compliment necessarily. It's not, oh, I hope everything goes great for you. It's more like, oh, bless your heart. You're just so stupid, or bless your heart, whatever you're saying. Anyway. One that I don't know that many people have heard this one, but I got to work with my dad was a builder, and so he consequently had a lot of carpenters working for him, and I got to work with the carpenters. And so consequently, I got to sit and listen to lunch conversations, and these guys would talk about politics and dog ticks and bed ticks, and it was just fascinating to listen to them. And they would pull me aside every now and then, now let me give you some advice, let me tell you. And I'll never forget one day we were working and a guy pulled me aside and he said, always work with the laziest man on the crew. And I'd never heard that before. Always work with the laziest man on the crew. And I was young enough that I kind of said, what do you mean? And he pointed kind of with his nose, like over to the guy that I knew was the laziest man on the crew. He pointed and he said, the laziest man's the smartest man. He always can figure out the easiest way to do everything. And he said, so if you work with the laziest man, you'll have an easier day. Not meaning that you'll shirk work, but that he'll figure, and he pointed to the guy and he said, see, I would never have thought to do that way. But that's a better way to do it than the way I would have done it. So he wasn't necessarily insulting the guy, but anyway, it was just funny. Always work with the laziest man on the crew. There's one that we actually have on our wall that's a woodcut, and I'll talk about the woodcuts later, but a woman can throw out more with a spoon than a man can bring in with a shovel, meaning that, again, there's this great Appalachian story that I've heard as a song as well as a story where the husband keeps telling the wife that she has an easy life. She just stays here all day, and he goes out and does the real work. So she says, well, let's swap. And of course, he can't get the food cooked, and he can't take care of the baby. And it's just this horrible, horrible day for him. And she comes back in sweating, but the work's been accomplished. So it's that idea of like, don't be thinking that just because you wield a shovel, your work's harder than mine. And I think that's a fun little old mountain saying. It's one of those that it's such a part of your language, it's sometimes even hard to hear them, to hear a saying or a proverb because, people just say that. And I got to serve a mountain church in Southwest Virginia, but I also got to serve a mountain church at the very southern extreme on Lookout Mountain down in Georgia, but down below Chattanooga. And it was very much a mountain culture, a mountain community. But even those two places, funerals were different at those two places. Funeral traditions, were different. Wedding traditions were different. There were some similarities, but even that little difference in area, the culture was different. So you kind of had to learn how to be the pastor of this church and not necessarily rely on everything you learned at the other one, because there were enough differences in that community. Well, when you first asked the question about holy living, I thought, Brad's really gone off the rails on this one. I just thought, oh no, we're talking about all these cultural things, and then suddenly it goes in this direction. But I really got to thinking about holy means to set apart, that it's something that's set apart. And in the end, that's the description of Appalachian culture, is that Appalachia has been set apart geographically, physically. We got good roads last. We got, it was hard to travel in Appalachia. And so really being set apart is kind of a mark of Appalachian living and culture. So it made me think about the fact that this 2021 is the 100th anniversary of the idea for the Appalachian Trail. And Benton Mackay was actually a community planner, a landscape architect. And World War I had been terribly devastating to the whole world. The flu epidemic of 1918, 1919. It was just a really tough time. And Mackay came up with the idea he suggested a trail that would run the Appalachians and connect from community to community. And in the original article, he argued that the range could be a refuge. These are the three words he used: a refuge, a sanctuary, and a battleground. And so he saw the region that way, as a refuge, a sanctuary. The battleground, I used to struggle with that until I really read the article a few more times carefully. What he's saying is that he was all about preserving, but what he was trying to preserve was not the land and not the creatures and not the vegetation. The battleground is for humanity, is to not lose humanity. And so the one creature he was interested in preserving was Homo sapien. And he saw that as that the Appalachians already had a hold of that, and that others should come and wander through. And so that's what I started thinking about when I started thinking about holy living, is that that there are these wonderful places in the Appalachians that are available to step away. One time, I think you may even have been on it when we did a walk at Convocation with pastors. And one of the comments I made that almost got kind of an audible response of, was I said, there is no place that any of us serve in Holston Conference that is more than 30 minutes from public land, publicly preserved land. National, state, even local. There's no place that anybody can serve that you have to drive longer than half an hour to get to something like that. And I think, again, that to me goes back to, for me anyway, as holy living is just, which really circles back around to the first discussion we had about place. The mountains, the geography, the geology. You can't, the Smokies, for instance. No coal mining has ever happened there because there's no coal there to mine. So thus you don't have mountaintop removal. You don't have that kind of work. Now, there was devastation, but it was lumbering. And so they just denuded the mountains. But they've come back quite well. So I guess for me, that is connected of having the place to be a part. So we have, you look, and I'm not talking about church camps, but you just look at how many camps are scattered up and down the Appalachians. And people who live all other kinds of places say, oh yeah, I went there as a kid. I went to the mountains as a kid. President Hoover looked for a retreat, and there was no Camp David. He found it in Shenandoah. He could get there from Washington easily, established a camp, which, by the way, you can still go visit it. It's a part of Shenandoah National Park now. He offered it to Roosevelt, but Roosevelt couldn't navigate this neat little camp area because of the wheelchair that he was in. And so Roosevelt loved the freedom of the water. And so that's why he loved to sail, is because then he could be in control of the vehicle. But when World War II came, the Secret Service wouldn't allow him to go out on the water anymore. And so they came up with a camp that had been for federal workers in the Appalachians, in the mountains of Maryland, and converted it so that he could have a retreat. But I'm just pointing out that here the President of the United States, when they're trying to figure out a way to get him away from Washington, they took him to the Appalachians. And so he named the retreat center Shangri-La, an ideal place in the mountains, Shangri-La. It was a popular book in the 30s, Lost Horizon. So Truman wasn't all about that. Truman loved to go down to Keys. That was his retreat. Eisenhower came and started using Shangri-La, but renamed it after his grandson David. So that's where we get Camp David. So now it's a presidential retreat since, Roosevelt, but really Eisenhower. Every president's used Camp David. But see, it's that apart, getting apart.